December 16, 1944 dawned cold and bitter across the Ardennes forest, where American soldiers huddled in foxholes along what they sarcastically called the Ghost Front. Private First Class Richard McKinley of the 106th Infantry Division stamped his boots against the frozen ground, his breath forming white clouds in the pre-dawn darkness. For weeks, this 85-mile stretch of Belgian woodland had been quiet. Too quiet, some veterans whispered. The High Command had deemed it a rest sector, a place where green troops could acclimate to war without facing the full fury of the Wehrmacht. But on this morning, hell itself would break loose. At precisely 5:30 in the morning, the earth erupted. German artillery pieces, more than 2,000 of them concealed in the dense forests across the Our and Sauer rivers, opened fire simultaneously. The barrage was unlike anything the Americans had experienced. Shells screamed overhead in a mechanical symphony of destruction, transforming the quiet morning into an apocalypse of fire and steel. Trees exploded into splinters. Foxholes collapsed. Men who had been writing letters home moments before simply ceased to exist. Lieutenant Colonel Mark Devine, commanding the 14th Cavalry Group near Manderfeld, grabbed his field telephone as his command post shook from the bombardment. The line was dead. Another explosion rocked the building, sending plaster cascading from the ceiling. Through the window he could see orange flashes illuminating the darkness like demonic lightning. This was no probe, no raid. This was something massive. 15 miles south, in the village of Echternach, Sergeant John Collins of the 12th Infantry Regiment stumbled from his billet as the first shells struck. The peaceful Luxembourg town had been a haven, a place where soldiers could almost forget there was a war. Now buildings burst apart like matchsticks, women screamed, children cried. Collins rallied his squad, moving them toward their defensive positions, but in the chaos and darkness, organization seemed impossible. As dawn broke gray and miserable over the shattered American positions, German infantry emerged from the forests like ghosts. They moved in waves, overwhelming isolated outposts. Behind them came the tanks, Panthers, Tigers, and the massive King Tigers, their engines roaring, their tracks crushing everything beneath them. The Ghost Front was ghost no more. It had become the gateway to the largest battle American forces would fight in World War II. The question every terrified American soldier asked that morning was simple and terrible. Could they hold? Within 2 hours of the initial bombardment, the German assault had torn gaping holes in the American defensive line. Captain James Robinson of the 422nd Regiment watched in horror as Volksgrenadier divisions, German infantry units rebuilt from scratch, swarmed across the Our River on rubber rafts and improvised bridges. His battalion had been spread impossibly thin, defending a front that should have required an entire division. Now they were paying the price. Robinson's radio crackled with desperate calls. Company A was surrounded. Company B had lost contact. Company C reported tanks, lots of tanks, rolling through the village of Au. The captain made the hardest decision of his life: withdraw to secondary positions or face annihilation. His men fell back through the snow, abandoning equipment, carrying wounded comrades, casting fearful glances over their shoulders at the pursuing Germans. On the northern shoulder of the penetration, the 2nd Infantry Division faced a different nightmare. They were in the middle of attacking the Siegfried Line when the German offensive struck. Now they found themselves fighting in 2 directions, forward against the prepared German defenses and sideways against the fresh assault forces. Major General Walter Robertson, commanding the division, recognized immediately that his men were in a death trap. The chaos was indescribable. Units lost contact with headquarters. Maps became worthless as the situation changed hourly. Communications broke down as German commandos, dressed in American uniforms and speaking perfect English, cut telephone lines and gave false orders. These soldiers, led by the infamous Otto Skorzeny, had been specially trained to spread confusion. They succeeded brilliantly. At the town of St. Vith, a critical road junction, Brigadier General Bruce Clark arrived to find pandemonium. Retreating troops streamed through the streets. Abandoned vehicles blocked intersections. Wounded men lay in the snow, waiting for aid that might never come. Clark, a tough armored commander, immediately began organizing a defense. If St. Vith fell, the Germans would have a clear path westward. The town had to hold. Meanwhile, further south, the 110th Infantry Regiment fought desperately to maintain positions along the Skyline Drive, a ridge overlooking the Clerve River. Staff Sergeant Harold Peterson and his squad had transformed a stone barn into a fortress, piling hay bales for additional protection. When German infantry approached, they unleashed devastating fire. But ammunition was running low, and German tanks were working their way up the valley below. Peterson watched through a crack in the barn wall as a Panther tank rumbled closer, its gun traversing slowly, searching for targets. "Hold fire," he whispered to his men. "Wait until they're close." The young soldiers gripped their rifles with white knuckles. Most had been in combat less than a month. Now they faced the finest soldiers Germany had left, troops pulled from the Russian front, veterans who had survived years of brutal warfare. The tank's gun suddenly swiveled toward their position. Someone had given them away. "Out!" Peterson screamed. "Everyone out the back!" The squad scrambled through a rear door just as the tank fired. The shell penetrated the barn's stone wall and exploded inside, turning their shelter into rubble. They ran through the snow, bullets kicking up ice crystals around their boots. All across the Ardennes, similar scenes played out. Small groups of Americans fought delaying actions, retreating from position to position, bleeding the German advance but unable to stop it. By nightfall on December 16th, the Germans had achieved penetrations up to 6 miles deep in some sectors. American casualties numbered in the thousands. Entire battalions had been cut off and surrounded. By December 18th, 1944, the situation had deteriorated from critical to catastrophic. German armored spearheads led by Kampfgruppe Piper of the 1st SS Panzer Division had penetrated nearly 20 miles into American territory. Behind them came entire divisions exploiting the gaps spreading like a cancer through the Ardennes. At Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force in Versailles, the atmosphere was tense. General Dwight Eisenhower convened an emergency meeting with his top commanders. "The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us and not of disaster," Eisenhower declared, his jaw set firm. "There will be only cheerful faces at this table." It was classic Eisenhower, refusing to panic, seeing the German offensive as a chance to destroy enemy forces in the open, rather than fighting through the Siegfried Line. But his subordinates knew the truth was more complicated. If the Germans reached the Meuse River and captured the bridges, the entire Allied front could collapse. The town of Bastogne, a nondescript Belgian market town of 4,000 inhabitants, suddenly became the most important piece of real estate in Europe. 7 roads converged there, making it the key to the entire Ardennes road network. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled the ability to move troops and supplies. Eisenhower ordered the 101st Airborne Division, then resting near Reims after the disastrous Operation Market Garden, to move immediately to Bastogne and hold it at all costs. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the Screaming Eagles in the absence of the division's regular commander, received the order on December 18th. His paratroopers, many still recovering from wounds received in Holland, loaded onto trucks without winter clothing, without proper ammunition reserves, without adequate maps of the area. They had no idea where they were going or what they would face. But they were airborne, the elite, and they would go. The truck convoy raced through the night, passing streams of refugees fleeing westward. Belgian civilians pushed carts piled with possessions, their faces etched with terror. They had lived through German occupation once. They had no desire to experience it again. American soldiers heading east asked the refugees what was happening ahead. The answers were grim. Germans everywhere, tigers, panthers. They shoot everyone. McAuliffe's paratroopers reached Bastogne on the evening of December 18th, just hours before German forces began to encircle the town. They immediately began preparing defensive positions, digging foxholes in the frozen ground, establishing roadblocks, positioning the few artillery pieces they had. By December 19th, advanced elements of the 2nd Panzer Division approached from the northeast, while the Panzer Lehr Division closed in from the south. Colonel William Roberts, commanding Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division, had arrived in Bastogne a day earlier with his tanks. He coordinated with McAuliffe, dividing the perimeter into sectors. The defenders would fight from a circular position, holding key roads and villages around Bastogne. It was a desperate plan, reminiscent of Alamo or Rorke's Drift, a small force surrounded by a vastly superior enemy, holding a vital position against all odds. Meanwhile, on the northern shoulder of the Bulge, the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions fought a desperate delaying action around Elsenborn Ridge. Colonel Jean Mabry's 38th Infantry Regiment held a critical section of the line against repeated attacks by the 12th SS Panzer Division. These teenage fanatics, indoctrinated with Nazi ideology, attacked with suicidal bravery. But Mabry's men stood firm, supported by devastating artillery fire. The stand at Elsenborn Ridge would prove crucial. By preventing the Germans from breaking through on the northern shoulder, the Americans anchored the entire defensive line. The German plan called for a rapid breakthrough here, but instead, the attackers found themselves locked in brutal grinding combat. Every hour of delay gave Allied commanders more time to move reinforcements into position. December 19, 1944 brought a horrifying discovery that would galvanize American resistance. Near the crossroads at Baugny, outside the town of Malmedy, military police found 84 bodies of American soldiers lying in a snow-covered field. They had been prisoners of war, captured by Kampfgruppe Peiper, herded into the field, and machine-gunned. Some had been shot in the head at close range as they lay wounded. The Malmedy massacre, as it would be known, violated every convention of warfare. Word of the atrocity spread through American units like wildfire. Soldiers who had been willing to surrender if circumstances became hopeless now vowed to fight to the death. The massacre transformed the battle from a military operation into something personal, something visceral. Lieutenant Howard Bowers of the 82nd Airborne told his men simply, "No prisoners." It was a dark moment, but understandable in the context of what had been discovered. Kampfgruppe Peiper, meanwhile, had its own problems. Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper, the 30-year-old commander of this armored battle group, had been personally selected by Hitler as one of the spearheads of the offensive. His orders were to reach the Meuse River bridges within 48 hours, regardless of cost. He commanded the best equipment Germany could provide: King Tiger tanks, Panthers, and battle-hardened Waffen-SS troops. But he was running out of fuel. The German offensive plan had assumed they would capture American fuel dumps intact. Instead, American engineers, in one of the most consequential decisions of the battle, destroyed their fuel supplies rather than let them fall into enemy hands. Near Stavelot, American defenders blew up a dump containing more than 2 million gallons of gasoline just as Peiper's tanks approached. The explosion lit the sky, and with it went German hopes of rapid exploitation. Peiper pushed west anyway, his tanks consuming their remaining fuel in a desperate race against time. At the town of Stoumont, he ran into elements of the 30th Infantry Division supported by tank destroyers. A vicious fight erupted. American 90mm guns engaged the German armor at point-blank range. King Tigers, supposedly invulnerable, burst into flames when shells found weak spots in their armor. The advance stalled. Back at Bastogne, the noose tightened. By December 20th, the town was completely surrounded. German forces numbered approximately 45,000 men against roughly 18,000 American defenders. General Heinrich von Luttwitz, commanding the 47th Panzer Corps, believed Bastogne would fall within hours. He was wrong. McAuliffe's paratroopers and Robert's tankers fought with ferocious determination, throwing back every probe, counterattacking when Germans gained ground, turning every building into a fortress. The weather remained miserable. Low clouds, snow, and fog prevented Allied aircraft from providing support. The defenders were on their own, rationing ammunition, treating wounded in cellars and churches, fighting off frostbite and fatigue. Medic Eugene Rowe of Easy Company, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, moved from position to position treating casualties, his medical supplies dwindling. He had no morphine left, no bandages. He improvised with whatever he could find, saving lives through sheer determination and skill. On December 22nd, German officers approached the American lines under a white flag. They carried an ultimatum from von Luttwitz demanding surrender. The message was delivered to McAuliffe, who read it and responded with a single word: nuts. When the German officers asked for clarification, Colonel Joseph Harper explained, "It means go to hell." The defiant response, when it became public, would inspire the entire Allied command and symbolize American determination. That same day, at Supreme Headquarters, Eisenhower met with General George Patton. "George, I want you to take your Third Army, break off your Saarland offensive, wheel 90 degrees north, and counterattack into the German flank." It was an audacious request, requiring the movement of an entire army across the front. Patton, never one for modesty, replied, "I can attack on December 22nd. Eisenhower looked skeptical. "Don't be fatuous, George." But Patton was serious, and he was as good as his word. December 23, 1944 dawned clear and cold across the Ardennes, and with the clearing skies came salvation from above. Allied fighter bombers and medium bombers, grounded for a week by terrible weather, roared into action. Thunderbolts and lightning swooped on German columns, catching tanks and trucks on narrow roads with nowhere to hide. Bombs and rockets turned the German supply lines into burning wreckage. In a single day, Allied aircraft flew nearly 5,000 sorties, the largest single-day air effort of the war in Europe. At Bastogne, paratroopers looked up as C-47 transport planes appeared overhead, escorted by fighters. Parachutes blossomed in the sky, red, blue, yellow, and white chutes carrying ammunition, medical supplies, and food. Some supplies landed inside German lines, but most reached the defenders. Morale, which had been sustained by sheer stubbornness, now soared. They were not alone. They were not forgotten. Help was coming. Major General Maxwell Taylor, the regular commander of the 101st Airborne, returned to his division on December 27th after being recalled from Washington. He found his men exhausted but unbroken, holding a perimeter that had been compressed but not breached. In the villages around Bastogne, Foy, Bizori, Noville, Marvy, his paratroopers had fought off repeated attacks by forces that should have overwhelmed them. They had done the impossible. Meanwhile, Patton's Third Army pushed north through appalling conditions. The 90th Infantry Division, 4th Armored Division, and 26th Infantry Division battled through snow, ice, and determined German resistance. Every mile was contested, every village had to be cleared. German paratroopers and Volksgrenadiers fought from prepared positions, making the Americans pay for every yard of ground. But Patton drove his men relentlessly, accepting heavy casualties to reach Bastogne before it fell. On December 26th, elements of the 4th Armored Division, led by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams' 37th Tank Battalion, broke through the German encirclement. At 4:50 in the afternoon, Sherman tanks rolled into Bastogne. The siege was lifted. Paratroopers and tankers embraced, exhausted men crying with relief. But the battle was far from over. The Germans would continue attacking Bastogne for weeks, trying to cut the corridor and retake the town. On the northern shoulder of the Bulge, the Germans had already been stopped cold. The heroic stand at Elsenborn Ridge, combined with fierce resistance at St. Vith, had prevented the breakthrough Hitler needed. When St. Vith finally fell on December 21st after days of desperate defense, it had delayed the German advance long enough to prove decisive. General Bruce Clark and his defenders had fought brilliantly against impossible odds, giving ground only when continuing resistance meant annihilation. Kampfgruppe Piper, the spearhead that was supposed to reach the Meuse, found itself trapped in a pocket near La Glaise. Out of fuel, low on ammunition, surrounded by American forces, Piper made the decision to abandon his heavy equipment and escape on foot. On December 24th, his surviving men slipped through American lines under cover of darkness, leaving behind their tanks and heavy weapons. The most dangerous German thrust had been neutralized. The human cost of the battle mounted horrifically. American casualties by Christmas exceeded 30,000, dead, wounded, missing, or captured. Entire units had been destroyed. The 106th Infantry Division effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force, having lost nearly 8,000 men in the first 3 days. The 28th Infantry Division, savaged in earlier fighting, lost thousands more. But the German losses were equally staggering and far more irreplaceable. Hitler's gamble had failed. According to military historian John Toland's Battle: The Story of the Bulge, the Wehrmacht committed its last mobile reserves to the offensive, losing approximately 100,000 men, 600 tanks, and 1,600 aircraft. These losses, unlike American losses, could never be replaced. Germany's strategic position, already desperate, became hopeless. The Ardennes offensive consumed resources that might have delayed the final collapse of the Reich by months. January 1st, 1945 marked not just a new year, but a new phase of the battle. The German offensive had reached its high-water mark on December 24th, when advance elements came within 4 miles of the Meuse River before being stopped. Now the tide turned decisively. Eisenhower ordered a counteroffensive to pinch off the Bulge from both north and south, trapping German forces in a massive pocket. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commanding Allied forces on the northern flank, moved cautiously, too cautiously for American tastes. The British commander, given temporary authority over the northern shoulder during the crisis, wanted to ensure his defenses were impregnable before counterattacking. His deliberate approach frustrated Patton, Bradley, and other American generals who wanted to strike immediately, while German forces were overextended and vulnerable. Nevertheless, the 1st and 9th U.S. Armies, temporarily under Montgomery's command, began pushing south. The 2nd Armored Division, commanded by Major General Ernest Harmon, engaged the 2nd Panzer Division in a vicious tank battle near Selles. The Germans, out of fuel and ammunition, fought desperately but were systematically destroyed. American tank destroyers picked off Panthers and Panthers at ranges where the German tanks couldn't effectively return fire. The Christmas Eve battle marked the end of Germany's deepest penetration westward. At Bastogne, now relieved but still partially surrounded, fighting continued with undiminished ferocity. The Germans launched a major attack on January 3rd, attempting to recapture the town and vindicate Hitler's obsession with the position. 7 German divisions, supported by what remained of the Luftwaffe in the west, hammered at American positions. The 5th Parachute Division attacked from the north, while the 39th Fusilier Regiment struck from the east. Captain John Pryor's company of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment held a critical section of line near Foy. German infantry, supported by assault guns, advanced across open snow-covered fields. Pryor's men held fire until the Germans were within 100 yards, then unleashed a devastating volley. Machine guns cut down entire squads. Mortars dropped shells with precision. The attack collapsed into confusion, leaving dozens of bodies sprawled in the snow, but German persistence was remarkable. Throughout January 3rd and 4th, attacks continued. Tank infantry teams probed for weaknesses. Artillery pounded American positions. Casualties mounted on both sides. The paratroopers, already exhausted from weeks of combat, found reserves of strength they didn't know they possessed. They held not just because of training or equipment, but because they had decided that Bastogne would not fall. It was a matter of pride now, of proving something to themselves and the world. On January 8, 1945, Patton's forces linked up with Montgomery's near Houffalize, effectively cutting the Bulge in half. German commanders, recognizing the danger of encirclement, began withdrawing their forces despite Hitler's orders to hold every inch of ground. The withdrawal was skillful, with veteran units covering the retreat, but it could not disguise the fact that Operation Wacht am Rhein had failed completely. The weather continued to play a crucial role. Clear skies allowed Allied aircraft to dominate the battlefield. German vehicles moving during daylight hours were sitting ducks for fighter bombers. The Luftwaffe, in a desperate attempt to regain air superiority, launched Operation Baseplate on January 1st, a massive strike on Allied airfields. German fighters caught Allied planes on the ground, destroying approximately 150 aircraft. But the Germans lost approximately 300 planes in the operation, losses they could not sustain. It was their last major air offensive of the war. Sergeant Bill True of the 82nd Airborne Division fought in the drive to close the Bulge. His squad advanced through the same forests where Germans had attacked in December, now liberating them village by village. The destruction was total, Burned-out tanks, smashed artillery pieces, frozen bodies of soldiers from both sides. True's squad came upon a German field hospital that had been abandoned in haste. Wounded German soldiers lay on stretchers in unheated barns, without medical care, some already dead from exposure. True's medic, despite orders to keep moving, stopped to treat the German wounded. "They're soldiers just like us," he said simply. True didn't argue. They left what medical supplies they could spare and pushed on, knowing full well that similar scenes of suffering were repeated across thousands of square miles of battlefield. By mid-January 1945, the bulge had been eliminated, and the front line restored to roughly where it had been before December 16th. But the Ardennes was transformed. Villages that had stood for centuries were rubble. Forests were splintered wastelands. The earth was scarred with shell craters and littered with the debris of mechanized warfare. And everywhere, frozen in the snow, lay the bodies of young men who would never go home. The American forces suffered approximately 89,000 casualties during the Battle of the Bulge, 19,000 killed, 47,000 wounded, and 23,000 missing or captured. The British forces, engaged primarily in the northern sector, lost approximately 1,400 men. These numbers, though staggering, told only part of the story. Thousands more suffered frostbite, trench foot, and psychological trauma that would haunt them for decades. Private Edward Paniche of the 99th Infantry Division survived the battle, but lost 3 toes to frostbite. He had held his position on Elsenborn Ridge for 5 days straight, never able to get warm, his boots frozen to his feet. When medics finally evacuated him, they had to cut his boots off. He spent 6 weeks in a hospital in England, then returned to his unit in time for the crossing of the Rhine. He never complained about his injury, considering himself lucky to be alive. German casualties were even more catastrophic in their strategic impact. Approximately 100,000 men were lost, killed, wounded, or captured. More importantly, Germany lost approximately 600 tanks and assault guns, 1,500 aircraft, and immense quantities of fuel, ammunition, and other supplies that could not be replaced. The Wehrmacht's mobile reserves, carefully husbanded for a decisive blow, had been expended in a failed gamble. The psychological impact on German forces was equally devastating. For years, German soldiers had believed in their tactical superiority over their opponents. The Ardennes offensive was supposed to prove that belief once more, demonstrating that Germany could still achieve spectacular victories. Instead, it demonstrated that American forces, given time to prepare and fighting on ground of their choosing, were formidable opponents. The myth of invincibility died in the snows of Belgium. For American forces, the battle was vindication. They had been surprised, driven back and surrounded, but they had not broken. Units like the 101st Airborne at Bastogne became legendary. The stand at St. Vith, the defense of Elsenborn Ridge, and countless small unit actions demonstrated that American soldiers could fight with determination and skill equal to any army in the world. The citizen soldiers of democracy had faced the professional warriors of totalitarianism and prevailed. The civilians of the Ardennes paid a terrible price. Thousands died in the fighting or from exposure. Entire villages were destroyed. Farms that had been in families for generations were obliterated. In Houffalize, only 11 buildings remained standing out of several hundred. In Bastogne, the civilian population had sheltered in cellars throughout the siege, emerging to find their town a wasteland. The reconstruction would take decades. Some stories of civilian courage emerged from the chaos. In the village of Chaumont, Madame Adèle Clesse hid 12 American soldiers in her home for weeks while Germans occupied the village. She fed them, tended their wounds, and kept their presence secret, even when German officers billeted in her house. When American forces liberated the village, she refused any recognition, saying simply that she had done what any decent person would do. Father Louis Delvaux, a Catholic priest in Bastogne, remained in the town throughout the siege. He converted his church into a hospital, treating wounded Americans and civilians alike. When German shells struck the church, killing several wounded soldiers, Father Delvaux continued his work without pause, giving last rites to the dying. comforting the terrified. After the war, the 101st Airborne Division awarded him an honorary membership, making him the only civilian so honored. The environmental destruction was staggering. The ancient forests of the Ardennes, some with trees hundreds of years old, were reduced to splinters. Artillery barrages and aerial bombardment had turned square miles of woodland into lunar landscapes. It would take generations for the forest to recover. Even today, 80 years later, farmers occasionally plow up unexploded shells and the remains of soldiers who were never recovered. The failure of the Ardennes offensive had profound implications for the remainder of World War II. Hitler's gamble had been based on the belief that splitting the Allied armies and capturing Antwerp would force the British and Americans to negotiate a separate peace, allowing Germany to concentrate all its forces against the Soviet Union. When the offensive failed, that possibility vanished entirely. Germany now faced certain defeat on multiple fronts, with no hope of avoiding it. The delay caused by the offensive, however, had consequences. Eisenhower's planned offensive into Germany, scheduled for January 1, 1945, was postponed by weeks while forces reorganized and rebuilt after the Ardennes battle. This delay allowed the Soviet Union to launch its massive winter offensive from the east, driving deep into German territory. When the war ended in May, Soviet forces occupied Berlin and much of Eastern Europe, a fact that would shape the post-war world for decades. Some historians have argued that Hitler's Ardennes gamble, rather than delaying Germany's defeat, actually hastened it by destroying the last mobile reserves that might have conducted an effective defensive campaign. Instead of trading space for time along prepared defensive lines, Germany expended its final offensive punch in a battle it could not win. The resources consumed in the Ardennes might have delayed the Allied advance by weeks or even months if used defensively. General George Marshall, U.S. Army Chief of Staff, visited the Ardennes in late January to assess the situation. He was impressed by what he saw, not just the courage of individual soldiers, but the resilience of the American military system. Units that had been shattered were rebuilt in days. Replacement soldiers were integrated into veteran units quickly and effectively. The industrial machine at home provided the weapons, ammunition, and supplies needed to sustain operations. America's strength, Marshall concluded, lay not in any single battle or commander, but in the entire system of mobilization, training, and logistics. For Germany, the opposite was true. The Wehrmacht could not replace its losses. There were no strategic reserves to call upon. The Luftwaffe had been smashed as an effective fighting force. Fuel shortages meant that tanks sat immobile even when crews were available. Most critically, trained officers and NCOs, the backbone of any effective military, had been killed in disproportionate numbers. The German army that faced the final Allied offensives in March and April 1945 was a hollow shell. The Battle of the Bulge entered American consciousness in a way few other World War II battles did. Perhaps it was the desperate nature of the fighting, the cold and snow that added another dimension of suffering, or the David versus Goliath quality of small American units holding out against superior forces. Whatever the reason, the battle became emblematic of American determination and resilience. In Germany, the battle was remembered differently, as a failure of leadership at the highest level. Veteran commanders who had opposed the offensive felt vindicated in their skepticism. Hitler's insistence on unrealistic objectives, his refusal to consider alternatives, and his micromanagement of tactical details had doomed the operation from the start. The Ardennes offensive became one more piece of evidence in the case that Germany lost the war as much through Hitler's incompetence as through Allied superiority. For the men who fought, the battle remained intensely personal. Sergeant Harold Peterson, who had survived the first day's fighting, made it through the entire battle and into Germany. He was killed by a sniper on March 18, 1945, 3 weeks before the war ended. Lieutenant Colonel Mark Devine, whose command post had been hit on the first morning, received the Distinguished Service Cross for his leadership. He survived the war and lived until 1993, giving numerous interviews about his experiences. Captain John Pryor, who had defended Foy during the counterattacks on Bastogne, stayed in the army and served in Korea. He never spoke publicly about his experiences in the Ardennes, telling his family only that he had done his duty and survived. Eugene Rowe, the medic who had improvised treatments with no supplies, returned to Louisiana and became a general practitioner, serving his community for 40 years. He, too, rarely discussed the war. These men, and hundreds of thousands like them, carried the memories of the Ardennes for the rest of their lives. They remembered the cold, the fear, the loss of friends, and the sheer determination required to keep fighting when everything seemed hopeless. They were not professional soldiers but ordinary citizens called to an extraordinary task, and they had not failed. February 1945 saw Allied forces fully recovered from the Ardennes battle and preparing for the final assault into Germany. The lessons learned in the bitter winter fighting informed planning for future operations. Infantry units received better winter equipment. Coordination between air and ground forces improved. Intelligence gathering, which had failed to detect the Ardennes buildup, was reorganized and strengthened. Most importantly, commanders at all levels gained confidence in their troops' ability to handle whatever the enemy might throw at them. The First Army, which had borne the brunt of the German offensive, led the assault on the Siegfried Line fortifications, the same positions they had been attacking when the Ardennes offensive struck. But now the situation was reversed. German forces were depleted, demoralized, and increasingly composed of undertrained replacements. American artillery, which had proven so effective in defensive fighting, now supported offensive operations with crushing effectiveness. Colonel James Rudder's 28th Infantry Regiment, rebuilt after its near destruction in the Hurtgen Forest and the Ardennes, led the assault on the Roer River dams. These massive concrete structures controlled water levels in the Roer River Valley and had prevented earlier Allied crossings. In a series of sharp actions between February 4th and 10th, American engineers captured the dams, finding that Germans had damaged the discharge valves but not destroyed the dams themselves. The resulting controlled flooding delayed river crossings for 2 weeks but did not stop them. The crossing of the Rhine River in March 1945 marked the final barrier to the Allied advance into the German heartland. The capture of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen on March 7th, still intact despite German attempts to destroy it, provided an unexpected opportunity. Lieutenant Karl Timmermann led the first troops across, despite enemy fire and uncertainty about whether the bridge would collapse. For 10 crucial days, the bridge stood, allowing thousands of troops and vehicles to cross before it finally collapsed on March 17th. By then, the Americans had established a firm bridgehead on the eastern bank. Meanwhile, Patton's Third Army, still driving north from its pivot during the Ardennes battle, crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim on the night of March 22nd without even an artillery preparation. Patton, ever the showman, telephoned Bradley. "Brad, don't tell anyone, but I'm across." When Bradley asked when, Patton replied, "Last night, we sneaked a division over, and they're expanding the bridgehead right now." Patton took enormous satisfaction in crossing the Rhine before Montgomery's much-publicized Operation Plunder to the north. The Ruhr Pocket, encircling Germany's industrial heartland, trapped more than 300,000 German troops in April. Rather than conduct a costly assault, American forces simply contained the pocket while driving deeper into Germany. The trapped German forces, lacking supplies and leadership, surrendered en masse. Among the prisoners was Field Marshal Walter Model, who had commanded German forces during the Ardennes offensive. Rather than face captivity and trial, Model shot himself on April 21st. By this time, Soviet forces were approaching Berlin from the east, and the race to link up with them was on. American and Soviet troops met at the Elbe River on April 25th at Torgau, effectively cutting Germany in two. The handshake between American Lieutenant William Robertson and Soviet Lieutenant Alexander Silvashko became an iconic image of Allied victory, though the genuine camaraderie it represented would soon give way to Cold War tensions. The speed of the Allied advance in the final months amazed even the most optimistic planners. Towns and cities that might have required weeks of fighting fell in days or hours. German units surrendered in battalion and regimental strength. The Wehrmacht, which had seemed invincible in 1940 and formidable even in 1944, simply disintegrated. The Battle of the Bulge had broken something fundamental in German fighting spirit. the belief that somehow, against all odds, Germany might still prevail. Private First Class Richard McKinley, who had endured that first terrible artillery barrage on December 16th, was among the troops who crossed the Rhine. His division, the 106th, had been rebuilt with replacements and returned to combat in March. McKinley found himself fighting in the same forests where he had been pushed back in December, except now the Americans were advancing and the Germans retreating. The symmetry was not lost on him. On April 12, 1945, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt died at Warm Springs, Georgia. The news shocked troops throughout Europe. Roosevelt had led America through the Depression and the war, his fireside chats providing comfort and confidence during the darkest days. Now, with victory in sight, he would not see the fruits of the struggle. Vice President Harry Truman, a relatively unknown senator from Missouri, assumed the presidency at one of the most critical moments in American history. The discovery of Nazi concentration camps in April horrified Allied troops who liberated them. The 82nd Airborne Division, veterans of the Ardennes and numerous other battles, entered camps near Ludwigslust and found conditions beyond comprehension. Emaciated prisoners, mass graves, evidence of systematic murder on an industrial scale. It confirmed every reason the war had been fought and justified every sacrifice made. Sergeant Bill True, hardened by months of combat, broke down weeping at what he witnessed. General Eisenhower, understanding the historical importance of documenting these atrocities, ordered that German civilians from nearby towns be forced to tour the camps and bury the dead. He also ensured that journalists and photographers recorded everything in detail. "Get it all on record now," he said. "Get the films, get the witnesses, because somewhere down the road of history some bastard will get up and say that this never happened." His foresight proved prescient. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his bunker beneath Berlin as Soviet forces fought their way through the city streets above. The man who had unleashed the war, caused the deaths of tens of millions, and nearly destroyed European civilization took the coward's way out rather than face the consequences of his actions. Germany's unconditional surrender came 1 week later, on May 7th, with the formal ceremony repeated on May 8th in Berlin. Victory in Europe Day, V-Day, brought celebrations across the Allied world. In London, Paris, and New York, crowds filled the streets in spontaneous outpouring of relief and joy. But for the soldiers who had fought through the Ardennes and beyond, the celebrations were more muted. Too many friends had died. Too much had been lost. They were grateful to have survived, but could not forget the cost. The officers and men of the 101st Airborne Division gathered in Bastogne on VE Day for a memorial service. They stood in the town square they had defended so desperately 5 months earlier, now partially rebuilt, Belgian and American flags flying side by side. General Maxwell Taylor spoke briefly, honoring the fallen, praising the living. Then they dispersed, most heading home, some remaining in occupation duty, all carrying memories that would never fade. The Battle of the Bulge's place in history was secured not just by its strategic importance, but by the human stories of courage, sacrifice, and determination it generated. In the decades following the war, survivors gathered annually to commemorate their experiences. The veterans of Bastogne formed particularly close bonds, their shared ordeal creating connections that transcended rank, background, and circumstance. They had been tested in the crucible and found they possessed reserves of strength they never knew existed. The Belgian people never forgot the Americans who fought on their soil. In Bastogne, the Mardasson Memorial was dedicated in 1950, a massive star-shaped monument overlooking the battlefield. Its galleries bear the names of American states whose soldiers fought in the Ardennes. The Bastogne War Museum, opened in 2014, tells the story through artifacts, testimony, and immersive exhibits. Every year on December 16th, Belgian civilians lay wreaths at American military cemeteries, honoring men who died liberating their country. The Henri Chapelle American Cemetery near Liège contains nearly 8,000 graves of American soldiers killed in the region, many during the Battle of the Bulge. The Luxembourg American Cemetery holds more than 5,000, including General George Patton, who requested to be buried among his men. These peaceful memorial grounds stand in stark contrast to the violent deaths they commemorate, offering places for reflection on the cost of freedom. Military historians have endlessly analyzed the Battle of the Bulge, drawing lessons about intelligence failures, defensive preparation, leadership, and resilience. The failure to detect German preparations despite considerable evidence remains a case study in the dangers of confirmation bias, commanders seeing what they expected to see rather than what evidence suggested. Intelligence analysts had reported German movements, but these were dismissed as defensive repositioning rather than offensive preparation. The battle also demonstrated the importance of junior leadership. When communications broke down and units became separated, sergeants and lieutenants made critical decisions that shaped the battle's outcome. The stand at Saint-Vith, the defense of Bastogne, and countless small unit actions succeeded because young leaders took initiative, adapted to circumstances, and inspired their men through example. The American military's emphasis on developing leadership at all levels, rather than relying solely on orders from above, proved decisive. For the German military, the Ardennes offensive became a symbol of Hitler's disconnection from reality. Professional officers knew the operation was doomed from the start. Insufficient fuel reserves, inadequate air support, unrealistic objectives, and overly complicated plans all guaranteed failure. But Hitler's grip on power was absolute, and no one could effectively oppose him. The battle became a case study in how dictatorial systems make catastrophic strategic errors because dissent is suppressed. The weather's role in the battle fascinated meteorologists and military planners for decades. The German attack succeeded initially because fog and low clouds grounded Allied aircraft. When the weather cleared on December 23rd, Allied air superiority became overwhelming. Modern weather forecasting and satellite surveillance have made such surprise unlikely, but the Ardennes remains a reminder of nature's power to influence human events in unexpected ways. Technical lessons were equally important. The battle demonstrated that heavy tanks like the King Tiger, while formidable in direct combat, were strategic liabilities when fuel was scarce and roads were narrow. American medium tanks like the Sherman, though individually inferior, could be produced in overwhelming numbers and maintained more easily. The battle validated American doctrine of quantity, mobility, and logistics over individual unit superiority. The psychological impact on survivors lasted lifetimes. Many suffered what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, though in the 1940s it was called battle fatigue, or shell shock, if acknowledged at all. Richard McKinley returned to Iowa after the war, started a farm and raised a family. But he never slept soundly again, waking at unexpected noises, reliving the artillery barrage that had opened the battle. He was not alone. Thousands of veterans carried invisible wounds that never fully healed. Some found healing through sharing their stories. Eugene Rowe, the medic, eventually began speaking to high school history classes about his experiences. He emphasized not the glory of war but its cost, the responsibility of citizenship, and the importance of remembering those who served. His talks were always quiet, factual, and deeply moving. Students who heard him never forgot the gentle man who had saved lives in the frozen forests of Belgium. The last surviving veterans of the Battle of the Bulge are now in their late 90s or older, and soon there will be none left who remember it firsthand. But their legacy endures in the freedoms they preserved, the institutions they defended, and the example they set. When 19-year-old soldiers held positions against overwhelming odds, when medics treated wounded under fire, when officers made decisions knowing lives depended on them, they demonstrated that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when called upon. The civilians of the Ardennes rebuilt their homes, villages, and lives with remarkable resilience. Madame Adèle Kless, who hid American soldiers, lived until 1998, beloved in her village as a symbol of quiet courage. Father Louis Delvaux continued serving his parish until his death in 1976, never seeking recognition for his wartime actions. Their stories, and thousands like them, remind us that wars are fought not just by soldiers, but endured by civilians who show their own forms of heroism. Modern visitors to the Ardennes can still see traces of the battle. Foxholes remain visible in some forests. Farmers still occasionally discover unexploded ordnance. Museums display artifacts, helmets with bullet holes, letters from soldiers to families, photographs of men who would never grow old. These tangible connections to the past help new generations understand the reality of events that might otherwise seem abstract or distant. The Battle of the Bulge stands as testament to the complexity of war, how careful planning can be undone by surprise, how desperate situations can be salvaged by courage and determination, how strategic mistakes compound into catastrophe, and how individual actions can influence vast events. It was not the largest battle of World War II, nor the bloodiest, but it captured essential truths about human nature under extreme stress. When the last veteran passes and living memory fades, the story will remain, told in books, commemorated in memorials, studied by historians, and remembered by those who value the freedoms won through such terrible sacrifice. The frozen forests where young men fought and died have returned to peace, but they bear witness still. What really happened when the Germans smashed into the American lines was this. They encountered soldiers who refused to break, who held when holding seemed impossible, who proved that free people fighting for a just cause possess a strength that tyranny can never overcome. That lesson, forged in the snows of the Ardennes in December 1944 and January 1945, remains as relevant today as it was 80 years ago. The price of freedom is eternal vigilance and, when necessary, sacrifice. The men and women who paid that price in the Battle of the Bulge deserve to be remembered not just for what they did, but for what they represented. The best of human courage in the darkest of times.